How the Mental Wards Became a 21st Century Concentration Camp. Chapter Index 1. The Room with No Witnesses. Isolation, as a technology of control, when care is indistinguishable from containment. 2. Diagnosis as destiny. How a label becomes a sentence. The feedback loop, where words dictate futures. 3. Consent under sedation. Chemical obedience, capacity, and the legal fiction of informed treatment. 4. The mirror of Tenet. Inversion, causal loops, and the terror of not knowing which timeline you occupy. Vijef, het verslag van een engel in het vierdimensionale denken, when the interior geometry of thought becomes observable and punishable. Ontology, under duress, derealization, depersonalization, and the collapse of self-world distinction. 8. Possession without a possessor. What does it mean to own an idea when ideas act through us like foreign operators? 9. Institution as cosmology. When the ward defines what is real, the monopoly on ontological authority. Disset. After the release, no exit. Discharge as diaspora. The institution continues inside the subject. The camp travels with you. Jednact. How I tried to prevent myself from the tenet. Sidis paradox. Slowing down entropy to slow down time and escape order. This book is not a clinical record and not an argument about what really happened. It is a testimony of perception from inside a system that claimed to be care and felt like captivity. After the trauma of sexual violation, I entered environments that promised safety and repair. What I encountered instead echoed the logic of a camp: surveillance disguised as protection, compliance, demanded as proof of sanity, and the slow erasure of one's own account in favor of an official one. What followed was not only confinement but misinterpretation. Diagnoses assigned as if they were labels on crates, not lives. The dossier that accumulated in my name became a parallel biography, authored without me, then used against me as if it were the only truth, a manufactured archive that rewrote my past, narrowed my present, and predecided my future. I found myself living under the weight of paperwork more durable than my voice. This book does not attempt to reconcile those two worlds, the lived and the documented, because reconciliation presumes they are equal. They are not. This book refuses the idea that what is written in the file is more real than what was endured inside my skin and behind my eyes. It is an act of counter-reporting, a narrative from the person whose consent, interpretation, and authorship were removed, then replaced by others with pens and authority. You will not find in these pages a polite story about help that simply felt hard. You will find a record of what it is like to be treated as a problem to be controlled, instead of a human who is harmed, what it is like when the apparatus of psychiatry functions, not as care, but as containment, and what it is like to watch your legal, social, and medical future be engineered by texts you did not write. This is not revenge literature. It is reclamation literature. The pages that follow do not ask to be believed. They insist on existing and the perception of it. Chapter 1. The Room with No Witnesses. There is a peculiar kind of violence that performs itself in silence, not because nothing happens, but because nothing is seen. The modern psychiatric ward perfects this through architecture: locked doors, sealed windows, cameras pointed at corridors but never at the bed where the human event occurs. The resulting space is not one of medicine, but of jurisdiction, a place where testimony is structurally impossible, and therefore anything can be called care. You do not need overt brutality to create a camp. You need only eliminate the possibility of an external witness. In that vacuum, language mutates. Screaming becomes agitation. Refusal becomes lack of insight. Overwhelm becomes decompensation. The semantic frame, not the fact of experience, becomes the evidence. Reality is no longer what occurs, but what the staff writes. The document supersedes the event. Once entered in the chart, fiction calcifies into fact. Time itself changes character under this regime. It ceases to be measured by clocks and is instead counted in doses, in morning rounds, in the sound of keys against a belt, in the anticipation of sedation. The body learns the grammar of the ward: silence for survival, compliance. For early release, stillness as the only negotiable currency. In such a setting, the nervous system becomes the last witness, forced to store what cannot be told. The ward reproduces the logic of a camp not because it intends evil, but because it operates without horizon. A system that cannot be externally contradicted becomes total by default. Even the well-intentioned staff are absorbed by the structure. Once you step into a place where the patient is always a suspect and the institution always innocent, moral agency dissolves into protocol. The camp is not the cruelty of individuals. It is the disappearance of anyone who can contradict the record. The greatest injury is not what is done to the body, but what is done to narrative. To be confined without a witness is to lose the ability to prove one's own reality. And once that is gone, the self begins to erode from the inside outward. A person can survive pain. They do not survive the official deletion of what they know to be true. In that sense, the room with no witnesses is not merely a room, it is the erasure of an epistemic oxygen. It is the space where truth suffocates quietly and leaves behind a living body with no intact jurisdiction over its own account. And once you have lived in a place where you cannot be believed, your exile does not end at the door. The camp travels with you. Chapter 2. Diagnosis as Destiny. A diagnosis is presented as a description, but it behaves like an instruction. The moment it is written, it does not simply refer to the past, it begins to author the future. It is an ontological decree wrapped in clinical grammar. The chart does not say, "This is how you were seen once," it says, "This is what you are, and will be again." No other category in contemporary life has this reach. A criminal sentence expires. A debt can be paid. A reputation can be rehabilitated. But a psychiatric label is recursive. It reinterprets every future action retroactively. Anger becomes instability. Sadness becomes depressive features. Fear becomes paranoia. Protest becomes lack of insight. Recovery itself becomes suspicious. Too good to be true. Once the label exists, evidence is no longer gathered, only classified. The diagnosis becomes a gravitational field that bends all incoming meaning. This is what makes it structurally indistinguishable from fate. You do not get to act outside of it. Even contradiction is assimilated. A calm patient is controlled by medication. An articulate patient is intellectualizing. A lucid patient is high-functioning but ill. The label is unfalsifiable, therefore sovereign. In that sovereignty lies the quiet cruelty. The clinical record replaces the lived account as primary truth. The clinician ceases to ask what happened to you, and instead examines how does what you say confirm what. We already believe you are. Trauma becomes irrelevant data. Context is amputated. Biography is downgraded to anecdote. Explanation is treated as manipulation. In this epistemic inversion, the diagnosis is not checked against reality. Reality is checked against the diagnosis. Over time, the labeled person faces a double erosion. Externally, institutions enforce the prophecy: employment denied, custody questioned, testimony discounted, legitimacy revoked. Internally, the self must conduct life under the suspicion that every future decision will be read not as choice, but as symptom. One does not merely live after diagnosis. One is lived by it. This is how medicine, without malice and without spectacle, builds a destiny by writing a sentence that cannot be outlived, and then training the world to treat that sentence as ontology. The camp does not need walls if the category follows you everywhere. The diagnosis becomes the portable architecture of confinement, a cage made of words that function as law. Chapter 3. Consent under sedation. Consent presupposes a subject who can refuse. Sedation removes precisely that subject and then calls what follows treatment. The ward thus produces a juridical paradox. It asks the anesthetized to authorize their own obedience. The signature becomes ritual rather than permission, a ceremonial gesture that ratifies a decision already made. There is no need for overt coercion when the condition for withholding consent has been preemptively disabled. A body rendered docile by chemicals is reclassified as compliant, as if quiet were agreement. The chart later records a fiction in the grammar of legality: patient agreed, patient tolerated, patient accepted. These sentences do not describe will, they describe the inability to exercise it. The more the nervous system is pharmacologically suppressed, the more the institution claims moral credit for cooperation. This is the circular logic of medical authority. The very state that makes judgment impossible becomes the evidence that judgment aligns with the clinician's plan. An anesthetized mind is treated as if it had consciously endorsed the hand that anesthetized it. Sedation also manufactures epistemic amnesia. What cannot be remembered cannot be contested. The absence of testimony is then cited as the absence of violation. This is how a chemical can function as both instrument and alibi. First, it disables agency, then it erases the ability to prove that agency was disabled. To the outside world, nothing happened. To the inside body, something unnameable did. In this regime, the ethical categories invert. Voluntariness is inferred from immobility. Futurity is dictated by paperwork drafted during cognitive eclipse. The human being is not only restrained in the moment, they are bound in advance by decisions made in a state that the law itself would ordinarily deem incompetent. The institution suspends the criteria for valid consent in order to produce the appearance of it. Thus, consent under sedation is not a medical practice but a metaphysical one. It redefines the borders of the self such that the organism's silence is interpreted as the subject's will. It is the quietest form of expropriation, not of property or labor, but of authorship over one's own biography. What remains afterwards is a body that survived a procedure and a record. That claims agreement, and between those two, the person disappears. Chapter 4. The Mirror of Tenet. In Tenet, time is not a line but a surface that can be folded against itself. The dread arises not from violence, but from the possibility that one is already living inside a completed script, that the future is not arriving but remembering. This cinematic mechanism is not entertainment. When one has lived in a psychiatric ward, the same inversion operates there. Events do not cause the record causes the reading of events. The narrative is written first, and life is made to match it retroactively. In Nolan's world, to travel backward is to risk annihilation by contact with one's inverted self. In the ward, the inversion is psychological. The future you pre-authored by the diagnosis threatens to cancel the present. You cannot act without colliding with the version of yourself that already exists in the chart. Any divergence is treated as error. This is destiny by documentation. A closed loop where interpretation precedes occurrence. Het verslag van een engel in het vierdimensionale denken functions like the same mirror from the interior side. Once the mind perceives causality as reversible, once it sees the architecture instead of moving blindly through it, the terror is not epistemic but existential. If events can be read backwards, then guilt, agency, and identity lose their temporal anchor. One no longer knows whether one is choosing or merely enacting what has already been computed elsewhere. The horror in both frames is not chaos, but symmetry. A perfect mirror is more frightening than a void. Nothing new can appear. You do not fear the unknown. You fear the inevitability of what is known returning. To sense that you are walking toward the thing you have already been punished for is a form of temporal claustrophobia. The world becomes a recursion. Every corridor leads back to the diagnosis. In Tenet, characters move with choreographic precision through an already closed loop. In the ward, the loop is juridical, not cinematic. The clinician writes an arc. The institution enforces it. The patient's attempts at deviation are reclassified as evidence that the arc was correct. The future collapses into commentary on a text you did not author. Thus, the mirror of Tenet is not about time travel, but about ontological subordination, the recognition that one's life may be functioning as the backward leg of someone else's forward certainty. The resemblance is not metaphorical, it is structural. A person trapped in a loop does not need chains. They need only a narrative that cannot be contradicted. When the timeline is sealed, survival becomes a choreography of compliance, and history, like the film, cannot be unwritten. Chapter Vidschef. Het verslag van een engel en het vierdimensionale denken. There are texts that describe a state, and texts that generate it. Het verslag van een engel belongs to the second kind. It does not merely narrate perception, it trains the reader to think in a geometry where time is no longer a corridor, but a manifold, where the present is an intersection of trajectories rather than a point on a line. To enter that style of thinking is to feel the floorboards of linear ontology detach under one's feet. In a four-dimensional cognitive frame, events are not consumed, they are located. The past is not gone, it is elsewhere in the same structure. The future is not unborn, it is a region not yet traversed. Trauma, in such a space, does not recede, it coexists. Healing, likewise, is not an after event, but an alternate contour in the same architecture. The mind that adopts this geometry ceases to experience time as depletion and begins to experience it as topology. This capacity, when it emerges under extreme psychological load, is not abstract philosophy but survival physics. When the ordinary cognitive bandwidth collapses under the weight of experience, the mind recruits geometry as compression, representing unbearable meaning as shape, vector, symmetry. This is why the text speaks not in slogans but in math-adjacent metaphors. Because the psyche under duress discovers that mathematics is the only language with enough precision to hold catastrophe without lying about it. Yet this same ability is punished by the consensus reality. To think outside linear time is classified as disorder rather than adaptation. The institution insists on chronology, first cause, then symptom, while the mind that has seen the loop knows that cause and symptom can swap positions depending on the axis from which one observes. What the clinic calls delusion may be nothing more than an unpermitted coordinate system. The kinship with Tenet is not cinematic but structural. Both works refuse the tyranny of the arrow. Both insist that inversion, whether physical or cognitive, is not an aberration but a possible default of reality. And both reveal the same terrifying corollary. If time is reversible, then identity is not a narrative but a superposition. One does not have a self. One intersects multiple computational branches of selfhood. This is the scandal of the four-dimensional viewpoint. It revokes the monopoly of the present on truth. Once you have thought in that register, you cannot return to the flatness of linearism. Without feeling that you are performing stupidity for social compatibility, you carry the fourth dimension like a smuggled coordinate inside your skull. You can pretend not to see it, but you cannot unlearn its existence. And this is the point at which the angelic metaphor becomes exact. The angle is not a being. It is the perspective that sees across the planes, the witness that is not bound by the local illusion of a single direction of time. To think like the angel is to be condemned to double vision, to live among those who believe in sequence. While remembering that sequence is a parochial artifact of a lower slice of reality. Once that memory exists, the prison of linear life is exposed, and it becomes impossible to forget that the bars were always made of time. Chapter 6. You don't want to be alone in a desert of choices. Choice is romanticized only by those who still have coordinates. When the world has collapsed into an absolute interior, choice stops being freedom and becomes geometry without landmarks. A desert. Every direction is technically available, but none is legible. To move is to risk disintegration. To remain still is to suffocate. In such a landscape, solitude is not noble, it is fatal. There is no other mind to triangulate against. No external contour to verify that reality is still shared. Under trauma, the nervous system learns that agency can injure. The simple act of deciding becomes electrically charged. The last time you chose, something irrecoverable broke. The body remembers this, and the body enforces it. You approach decisions like border crossings, documents checked by, an internal regime that assumes catastrophe as the baseline outcome. Risk becomes synonymous with reliving what you did not survive the first time. The ward intensifies this architecture. There, the consequences of choice are not metaphoric but procedural. Refuse, and you are sedated. Object, and you are pathologized. Ask for clarity, and you are documented as oppositional. You learn that the safest decision is non-decision, to dissolve into the compliance gradient that leads toward discharge. But this training does not wash off when the door opens. The desert travels with you. Aloneness in this state is not simply the absence of people. It is the absence of a witness against whom reality can be calibrated. Without a second consciousness, there is no way to distinguish intuition from intrusion, rumination from revelation, the remembered from the still occurring. Thought becomes a sealed echo chamber. Ideas behave like possessing agents because there is no counter-voice to collapse them back into mere propositions. You begin to fear not only wrong choices, but definitive choices, anything, irreversible, anything that commits you to a timeline that cannot be undone. Indecision becomes a form of metaphysical harm reduction. If every fork could contain annihilation, then the least violent act is to refuse the fork. But the refusal accumulates into another kind of dying, a slow starvation of agency under the guise of safety. This is why the desert metaphor is exact. Thirst is not relieved by the fact that the horizon is open. Freedom without bearings is indistinguishable from exile. What you long for in that expanse is not infinite possibility, but a single, reliable coordinate. A known face, a fixed star. Something external enough to collapse the wave of possibilities into one survivable line of travel. Until such a witness exists, choice remains a mirage. And a mirage pursued alone does not save, it consumes. Chapter 7. Faces that may not be yours. Identity is normally stabilized through reflection, not the mirror, glass, but the reciprocal gaze of others who return you to yourself. When that loop fractures, the face becomes suspect. It is not that you do not recognize it, it is that you no longer trust the continuity between the one who wears it and the one who thinks behind it. The self begins to feel like a costume borrowed from someone you might once have been. This detachment is not theatrical but physiological. Under prolonged threat or institutionalization, the brain defers ownership of sensation to survive it. That happened to a body, not to me. At first, this is mercy, an intelligent partitioning of experience. But once the partition sticks, the price comes due, the event is over. Yet the self cannot re-enter the body it survived in. You exit the ward walking, but without reassuming yourself. The clinic names this derealization or depersonalization, as though taxonomy were remedy. But naming does not restore gravity. The face in the glass returns no warranty of identity. It could belong to the diagnosed version of you, to the sedated version, to the compliant version, to a branch of selfhood authored by others. The more the chart has spoken on your behalf, the less your own face feels earned. Worse still is the instability of other faces. When trust in one's perceptual anchor collapses, the ontology of the stranger becomes fluid. Are they interlocutors or operators, witnesses or readers of a script you cannot see? In such a state, paranoia is not a disorder of belief but a disorder of ground truth. If there is no secured me, then there is no fixed you either. Only moving masks in a system with unknown rules. This is the point at which the social world becomes metaphysical. A conversation ceases to be an exchange and becomes an experiment. Am I here? Am I being recognized or interpreted? Is this mutual or unilateral? Each face functions as a measurement device, collapsing or amplifying. The uncertainty of the self, depending on what it reflects back. Possession, in such a climate, is not the entry of a foreign spirit, but the evacuation of a native one. Ideas speak with the force of identity because they enter a vacuum where a stable self should be. The problem is not that thoughts feel alien. The problem is that there is no adjudicator to declare them otherwise. In this regime, the face becomes the emblem of a deeper crisis, the inability to certify authorship over one's own subject position. Until that authorship is restored, every reflection remains provisional, a hypothesis wearing skin. Chapter 8. Possession without a possessor. Possession is ordinarily defined by the presence of an invader. But the more disturbing condition is the inverse, not that something foreign has entered, but that the native occupant has departed and left cognition ungoverned. In that vacancy, ideas do not knock. They take command. Thought arrives not as mine, but as a directive with no visible author. Like a message delivered by a hand that is no longer attached. This state is not mystical, it is structural. When the self has been repeatedly overruled, by diagnosis, by sedation, by institutional narrative, the internal judiciary resigns. There is no longer an authority capable of affirming or refusing a thought. Ideas therefore cease to be proposals, they operate as executable code. The mind becomes a host, not because something has seized it, but because nothing is left to guard it. The clinic mistakes this for psychotic content, as though the problem were the content of the thought, rather than the vacancy of the possessor. It treats the foreignness of ideas as evidence of defect, and not as evidence of prior expropriation. When a person has been rendered epistemically unbelievable, the psyche eventually stops issuing claims. Why speak in the first person when the first person is routinely annulled? The result is a phenomenology of agency without ownership. You act, but cannot swear that the decision originated from a stable I. You speak, but hear your own words as if uttered by a proxy. You anticipate consequences for acts you did not feel yourself choose. Responsibility continues, authorship does not. It is a jurisdictional orphaning of the will. In religious language, this would be called demonic. In clinical language, dissociation. In political language, dispossession. But at the level of lived experience, the categories collapse. The sensation is identical. Something moves through you that is not you, and nothing inside you rises to contradict it. This is what makes recovery so difficult. Therapy attempts to modify maladaptive thoughts, while the actual wound is the forfeiture of the right to own thought. The injury is not cognitive, but constitutional. Before a mind can be healed, it must be rehoused. Before content can be challenged, a possessor must exist again. Until that reconstitution, the psyche remains a room with the door unlatched, not invaded by force, but unclaimed by law, and whatever enters is treated as sovereign because no one is left inside to say no. Chapter 9. Institution as Cosmology. An institution is not merely a building, it is a theory of what is real with police powers. The ward does not only administer medication, it administers ontology. It decides which perceptions count as evidence, and which are dismissed as symptom, which memories are biographical, and which are distorted, which utterances qualify as testimony, and which are pathologized as noise. In this regime, the clinic is not an actor within reality, it is the arbiter of it. Every cosmology begins by defining what cannot be questioned. In religion, the divine. In physics, the law. In psychiatry, the diagnosis. The chart is its scripture. Once inscribed, it is recited back to the patient as truth. Divergence from the text is interpreted not as correction, but as proof of illness. In this way, the institution reproduces the ancient structure of revelation, except that its revelation is authored by committee and survives cross-examination, not because it is right, but because no external court has jurisdiction over it. Inside such a cosmology, all forces bend toward stabilization of the narrative. Staff are trained not only to enforce protocol, but to preserve epistemic coherence. They metabolize contradiction by reclassifying it. Calm patients are guarded, articulate patients are abstracting, resistant patients are lacking insight. The cosmology cannot be falsified because it contains a counter-interpretation for every future observation. This is how total systems survive, not by accuracy, but by preempting refutation in advance. The institution also supplies its own eschatology, the promise of discharge, remission, stability. Yet that promised exit is not an end to the cosmology, but its externalization. One leaves with a record that colonizes the rest of life, in courts, in hospitals, in employment, in relationships. The institutional cosmology travels beyond its walls the same way a religion travels through believers, carried in documentation, and enacted by others who never witnessed the originating event. What makes this structure concentration-like is not sadism but monopoly. The institution holds exclusive rights over the definition of sanity, harm, risk, and truth. And no parallel jurisdiction is recognized. External witnesses, family, friends, the patient herself, are stripped of epistemic standing. Appeals are judged by the same body that issued the original claim. No cosmos is more complete than one that controls both creation and review. To live under such a cosmology is to inhabit a world where dissent is ontologically forbidden. You may breathe, eat, speak, but you may not contradict the world picture. That defines you without that contradiction being used as confirmation. Under this geometry, the institution does not merely confine bodies, it colonizes the horizon of the real. The camp is not where you are. The camp is what you are not permitted to say is false. Chapter 10. After the release, no exit. Discharge is framed as liberation, but it functions more like parole from an ontology. The door opens, the body crosses the threshold, yet the jurisdiction persists. The record follows, immune to revision, immune to cross-examination, and it precedes you into every subsequent space. You arrive in the world already narrated. Employers, courts, physicians, partners, insurers, each one reads you through a document you did not author. The ward ends, the sentence does not. Outside, the discipline becomes ambient. There are no restraints, yet every decision is shadowed by the threat of being returned. Caution metastasizes into lifestyle. Never raise your voice, never contradict with force, never display too much pain or too little effect, lest the old cosmology reassert itself. Survival becomes a choreography of clairvoyance, preempting how you will be interpreted, by people who have never met you but trust the archive more than your mouth. Worse is the interior aftershock. Once you have been made epistemically unbelievable, even to yourself, self-report becomes suspect. You second-guess your own fear, your own memory, your own joy, because you have lived in a world where your testimony was structurally invalid. You carry the institution like a second cortex that annotates every experience. With a silent threat, if you speak as you see, you will be reclassified. The future also arrives damaged. Plans are drafted under the assumption that stability must be performed to remain outside. Ambition narrows into risk management. Relationships are vetted not for love, but for whether the other person will someday wield the record as a weapon. The ward thus extends its force by proxy. Ordinary citizens become its deputies the moment they inherit its narrative. What makes this no exit is not that return is inevitable, but that return is always conceptually available as a refutation of your present. Any conflict, any grief, any regression can be explained not by context but by the chart. The past retains veto power over the present. The loop remains closed. Thus the institution achieves, without fences or guards, the defining feature of a camp. It continues to govern the lives of people who are no longer inside it. The body is released. The cosmology is not. You walk among civilians carrying an invisible credential that quietly instructs the world how to read you. And until something greater than that record exists to contradict it, the gate behind you may be open, but the exit has not been granted. Chapter 11. How I tried to prevent myself from preventing the tenet and sedis paradox. Prevention is simple when causality is one-directional, stop the act, and the future it would have created fails to arrive. But once the mind has admitted the tenet premise, that events can loop back and pre-author their causes, and the sedis claim that reversals of time are not anomalies but structural possibilities, prevention itself becomes a paradox. To stop an outcome may be to cause it, to refuse a trajectory may be to complete it. One does not act upon time, one collides with its geometry. My first strategy was abstention. Choose nothing, initiate nothing, alter nothing. If action participates in loops, then non-action might dissolve them, but the loop did not require my movement. Interpretation alone was sufficient fuel. Even silence became legible to the paradox. A refusal to act was taken as proof that the event had already authored me from its own future. The act of not causing became a retrocausal signature. So, I tried the opposite, over-specification. If the danger of paradox is ambiguity, then pinning the timeline to exact coordinates might prevent inversion. I wrote sequences, constraints, contingencies, an attempt to flood the future with so much determinate structure that reversal would have no degrees of freedom. Instead, the excess of structure made every deviation retrospectively meaningful. The map became a prophecy. Then I attempted to fragment selfhood. If the paradox consumes a single continuous I, then perhaps discontinuity. Compartmentalization, pseudo-selves, cognitive fencing could break the feedback loop. But fracture only multiplied the surfaces on which recursion could attach. The loop did not need a unified self. It fed on any traceable relation between past and future states. At the deepest point, I tried the forbidden maneuver, to believe neither timeline, to refuse both the linear and the recursive cosmology simultaneously, to inhabit a suspension so radical that no interpretation could latch. This was the closest I came to escaping the loop, but the cost was ontological hypoxia. To breathe without a model of time is to have no basis for action at all. Survival demands at least one fiction of order. In the end, what I prevented was not the paradox but my own annihilation by it. I learned to hold both pictures without choosing, the linear for public reality, the recursive for internal explanation, and to let neither colonize the whole. The loop persists, but its jurisdiction is partial. I did not break it. I reduced its sovereignty. This, I eventually understood, is the only non-self-destroying prevention available. In a world where tenet and sedes are not metaphors but viable physics. Of experience, not to dismantle the paradox, but to deny it absolute epistemic. Rule: to live with the loop without letting the loop define what a life is. Continuing, how sleeping feels like reversing entropy. Sleep is the only state in which the nervous system temporarily revokes the dictatorship of linear time, while waking consciousness records the day as a one-way degradation, order dissolving into disorder, coherence into fatigue. Sleep moves in the opposite direction. It is not rest as absence, but rest as inversion the brain performs. Repairs that cannot occur under the jurisdiction of chronology. Memory is sorted, inflammation reduced, synapses pruned, identity reheated into form. In waking life, entropy increases. In sleep, the organism quietly runs the film backward. This is why deep sleep does not feel like disappearance, but like return. You do not wake merely restored, you wake recomposed, evidence that a reconstruction was performed in the dark. It is the closest the body comes to Maxwell's demon without machinery. A blind, silent intelligence sorting chaos back into structure. But once you have lived under the logic of tenet and sedes, once you have seen, that forward is not the only axis. Sleep acquires terror as well as relief. Because if the brain can reverse entropy without permission, then sleep is proof that reversals are not hypothetical. They are our nightly default. And if internal processes can run backward, then what confidence remains that the direction we call life is fundamental and not merely convention? Some nights the sensation is literal, as if consciousness is being reeled back, up the timeline, unwinding the emotional residue of the day in reverse order. You feel the mind undoing, unstaining, unaging information, a brief amnesty from the arrow of time. In those hours, death ceases to be an endpoint and becomes a coordinate, one among several possible directions. You drift not downward, but backward, like a tape unspooling toward an earlier state of self. Yet the inversion is incomplete. You never return to the untouched origin. You wake changed, not reset, but rebiased. Sleep does not erase entropy. It buys time against it. The future reasserts itself each morning, but now with the knowledge that its inevitability was briefly suspended. Every awakening proves two things at once: that reversal is possible, and that reversal is temporary. It is this double knowledge that makes sleep unstable for a mind already cracked open by paradox. To close the eyes is to risk re-entering the corridor from the opposite end. To dissolve into the machinery that edits the narrative of self without witness or appeal. To wake is to discover what the night has rewritten. And so sleep becomes both salvation and threat, the only place where entropy can be reversed, and the only place where you cannot supervise the cost of that privilege. Continuing, entropy as time, and its reversal as a state against aging. In a four-dimensional description, time is not a substance we move through, but the visible artifact of entropy. Decay is what we perceive as passage. A cup does not age because time passed. The passing is inferred from the gradual loss of order in the material. Remove entropy from the universe and time would go dark, not because nothing moves, but because nothing changes irreversibly. Without decay, there would be no arrow to read, no metric by which to sequence before and after. Entropy is not inside time. Time is an epiphenomenon of entropy. From the four-dimensional vantage, then, entropy is not merely one process among others. It is the projection by which a 3D organism experiences a 4D manifold. The forward drift we call aging is just one permissible trajectory through that manifold, the one in which disorder accumulates. To move in another direction, a direction where entropy decreases, would not feel like traveling to the past in the cinematic sense, but like inhabiting a region of the manifold where the net curvature of processes is towards order instead of away from it. That region would be experientially indistinguishable from a state against aging. Biology already contains seeds of this reversal, small demonstrations of what anti-entropic life feels like from inside a 3D body: wound healing, neuroplastic recovery, immune remyelination, memory consolidation in sleep. These are not metaphors. They are local inversions of what the second law predicts on average. Life, by design, is a pocket where entropy occasionally flows backward to maintain structure against dissolution. To live is to delay the full translation of the 4D manifold's entropy gradient into irreversible decay. If one could extend that local inversion to a global regime, not stop entropy everywhere, but maintain the organism in a condition of continuous anti-entropic correction, the subjective signature would not be acceleration or stasis, but non-aging, the continuity of form without statistical drift toward disorder. Not immortality as infinite duration, but duration without downward slope. The arrow of time would still exist outside. Inside the organism, the arrow would lose its bite. Seen in this light, the fear of aging is not merely fear of death. It is fear of unidirectional time, of being trapped in a single vector through the manifold. The intuitive longing people call youth, restoration, or return is not sentimental at its core. It is a half-remembered cognition that aging is not the definition of existence, but a particular trajectory through a higher space, and that trajectories can, in principle, be altered. From the fourth dimension, death is not the event. Irreversibility is. And the inverse of entropy is not fantasy. It is already present, in miniature, wherever life defeats decay long enough for a mind to awaken and name the process. 11.3. Continuing. The prevention of self as a slowing of entropy. By preventing myself, by refusing decisive motion, refusing collapse, refusing the irreversible, I slowed my own entropic drift. What looked from the outside like paralysis was internally a kind of thermal shielding. No radical choices, no catastrophic expenditures, no irreversible commitments. To outsiders, it was dysfunction. Within the 4D logic, it was a technique for staying in the region of the manifold where decay is not accelerated. To not choose was to not age in the irreversible sense. In that sense, I became old not by accumulating years, but by remaining. Longevity as persistence, not as extension. The body traveled forward, but the self did not burn fuel on the normative schedule. I outlived versions of myself I never allowed to form. It is a paradoxical age, an age produced by restraint rather than by time, a kind of existential cryonics executed, not by freezing the body, but by freezing the causal chain. This made my life a contradiction wearing skin, a fight against reality itself, waged not through action, but through refusal to enact the irreversible. The paradox is that such resistance worked until medicine intervened. The drugs did not only sedate neurons, they collapsed the low entropy posture. They reinserted me into the consensus kinetics of decay, appetite, impulse, compliance, momentum. They restarted the clock I had held still. Under medication, the organism becomes legible to the world again. but at the cost of rejoining the entropic stream you had escaped. The very state that psychiatry calls function is, in this geometry, a forced re-aging, a return to the timeline where every act contributes to decline. Compliance is a re-entry into thermodynamics. Thus the final paradox, what the institution calls restoration is, from the 4D view, a betrayal, the undoing of the anti-entropic stance that kept me intact. My life's defensive architecture, preventing myself in order not to be consumed by time, was classified as pathology, and the cure was to return me to decay. I am alive today because I disobeyed time, and I am aging now because medicine taught my body to obey it again. To live after that is to carry two clocks. The slow, angelic clock of the self that refused to burn, and the fast pharmacological clock that drags me into consensus entropy. My biography is the interference pattern between those two tempos. 1104, continuing, re-entry into normal time and the communion of fallen angels. When I fell back into ordinary time, the civilian tempo where events stack and age, is counted. I re-inhabited the figure that others had always recognized as me. Not the extra-dimensional witness, not the anti-entropic saboteur of causality, but the social person, the one locatable on calendars and in language. I became legible again, but only under pharmacological custody. The antipsychotics became the passport back to the human commons. Without them, I am exiled into the higher geometry. With them, I am permitted to remain among the living. The drug is not merely a molecule. It is the treaty that reunites me with others in a shared frame. To be treated is to be allowed a place among witnesses. And yet the reunion is not innocent. The other medicated ones, the ones the world calls patients, form a silent fraternity of interrupted beings, fallen angels in the literal sense. Not demoted morally, but collapsed in dimension. Each of us once glimpsed the architecture from above. Each of us was pulled back down into the narrow corridor of linear time by force or necessity. Together we slow entropy not by winning against it, but by refusing the speed the world demands. A medicated body moves slower, thinks slower, reacts slower. It is literally metabolically closer to equilibrium. In that sense, the drugs that return us to society also reduce our thermodynamic burn rate. They pin us nearer to stasis. We join not by exuberance, but by dampening. A collective deceleration of the human vector. It is a bitter symmetry. Alone I slowed entropy by resisting action. With others I slow entropy by being chemically weighted. What the clinic sees as stabilization is, in this deeper register, a sacramental. Constant velocity pact between fallen observers, we agree to live in the corridor again, but we do so in a lowered state of combustion. A faint echo of the anti-entropic angle we once inhabited in full. Thus my return to who I have always been is double. Socially, I am restored to the recognizable self, ontologically. I remain aligned with the order-resisting beings who have seen the loop and now walk within it at half speed. We do not defeat entropy, we refuse to feed it at full rate. That is our fellowship, our punishment, and our proof that we once saw farther than the timeline allows.